I'm Marlene Hargrave. I turned 79 last spring, and I still keep fresh flowers in the same kitchen vase my husband picked out 35 years ago. The morning this all began, I had just brewed a pot of Earl Grey and was watching sunlight fall across the tiles like it always did, soft and steady. I'd made lasagna the night before because Bentley was supposed to visit, and that used to be his favorite, but lately, when he calls, I can already hear Marilyn in the background directing everything. I opened the door, expecting a quiet afternoon visit. Instead, I saw Bentley smiling too wide, and Marilyn standing behind him with a look I hadn't seen since the day she met me, when she was still trying to pretend she liked me. She stepped inside with the kind of hug that smells like perfume and ambition. And the moment she asked about the house, I knew they hadn't come for dinner before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to smile through a conversation you didn't trust. I was born in Macon, Georgia, raised on cornbread and quiet patience, my mother used to say. Kindness doesn't cost you anything, but it can buy you peace. And for most of my life, I believed that my husband, Pearl, was a financial analyst. The kind of man who read market patterns like novels and could tell you what the Dow would do 2 weeks ahead of time without blinking. He wasn't famous, not the TV type, but his peers listened when he spoke. We raised our son Bentley in this 2-story house just north of Atlanta, the same house I still keep spotless with my own hands. Pearl passed 3 years ago, and since then I've stayed busy. I manage my pension, my accounts. I mow the lawn when the weather's kind. I cook every meal myself, and if you ask me where I keep my important documents, I can point to the exact file drawer with labels I printed in '92. I never asked Bentley for help, not once. And yet lately, they look at me like I'm the antique in the room. The last few times they came by, it felt rehearsed, too much politeness. Marilyn always talking about her catering business, and Bentley nodding along like it was a board meeting. Not a visit home this time. They sat in my kitchen, eating my lasagna, and dancing around the subject of Sunny Acres. Marilyn mentioned it, like it was a spa resort, not a retirement facility, and Bentley kept bringing up how safe it would be after my little slip on the porch last year. Which wasn't a slip, by the way, just a misstep, and I told him so. Then Marilyn did something strange. She asked about Pearl's watches. Bentley joined in acting nostalgic, but I could see something in their eyes. They weren't just remembering, they were planning. I lied and said they were in a safety deposit box. Marilyn nodded, like she believed me, but her smile was thinner than usual. After they left, I called Doris my neighbor. She's 74 and doesn't miss a thing. I told her about the conversation about the watches about Sunny Acres, and the way Marilyn looked at the hallway like she was counting square footage. Doris said, what I didn't want to admit out loud, that maybe they weren't just planning for my future. Maybe they were planning for theirs. That night, I went to the linen closet and reached behind the old quilts for the watch box. I opened it slowly, one by one. The watches were there, just as Pearl had arranged them. But when I reached for the velvet slot where his favorite used to sit, the Vacheron Constantin, the one he bought in Geneva on our anniversary trip in '88. The slot was empty. I searched the room. Every drawer, every shelf, every place. I might have moved it in a moment of forgetfulness, but it was gone. And deep down, I already knew who had taken it. What I didn't know then was that the watch wasn't just missing. It was hiding a secret that would change everything. The morning after I found the empty slot where Pearl's watch should have been, I stood in the kitchen staring at the kettle, waiting for the water to boil. I couldn't shake the feeling in my chest tight, like something had come unmoored. I'd spent most of my life believing in the safety of quiet routines. Boil the water, brew the tea, call Doris. She opened the door before I even knocked. You look like you didn't sleep, she said, stepping aside to let me in. I sat down in the wicker chair on her sun porch and told her everything. The missing watch, the visit, Marilyn's interest in the collection. Doris listened without interrupting, just pressed her lips together the way she always did when she was angry, but didn't want to say it out loud. "Do you think they took it?" she asked finally. I nodded. "I can't prove it, but I know it was there before their last visit." She set her coffee down a little too hard. "Well, if they did take it, they're fools. That piece must be worth a fortune." "It's not just that," I said. Pearl treated it differently. He kept it separate from the others, always careful with it. He used to say a good watch has a soul. We sat in silence for a while. Then Doris said, "You should check with Liam, see if anyone's tried to sell it." I'd known Liam Brody for years. He ran an antiques shop over on Hawthorne Street, the kind of place with creaky floors and soft jazz playing in the background. Pearl used to take his watches there for servicing. If anyone would know, it'd be Liam. I called later that afternoon. His assistant said he was out of town until the weekend. I thanked her and hung up, then went back upstairs to double-check the jewelry box. I opened the lid, took out each watch one by one, checked their faces, the clasps, the hinges. All 4 were still there. Only the Vacheron was missing. 3 days later, Liam called. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Adelaide," he said, "I think we need to talk. He asked me to come to the shop. It's about one of Pearl's watches. Your son and his wife brought it in." I felt something drop inside me. Which watch, I asked, though I already knew. "The Vacheron," he said. They wanted it appraised. I took a cab to the shop that afternoon. Liam met me at the front and ushered me into his back office, a quiet room lined with velvet cases and catalogs that smelled faintly of leather and dust. The watch was sitting on the table. My husband's initials were still etched inside the lid. P.W. The year 1988. "They said you gave it to them after Pearl passed." Liam said carefully, watching my face. "I didn't," I said. "It was taken from my home." He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "There's something else. When I examined it, I found a hidden compartment in the back. I don't think they knew about it, but they were very persistent. Marilyn especially. Asked a lot of questions about the mechanism." He slid a small envelope across the desk. This was inside. I opened it and pulled out a photograph. A young woman, dark hair, serious eyes. She looked no more than 20, maybe 22. On the back, in Pearl's handwriting, was a name. Eleanor. The year 1964. And 2 words. "Forgive me." There was also a tiny brass key tucked inside the envelope, delicate and old-fashioned, no longer than my pinky. It had an intricate head with a carved pattern I didn't recognize. Liam said, "You'll want to keep this safe. I haven't told them I found anything. I told them I needed time for the appraisal. They're expecting to hear back from me in a few days." I thanked him, placed the envelope in my purse, and left the shop. That night, I called Doris again. We sat on her porch with a pot of chamomile between us, and I showed her the photograph and the key. "You ever hear him mention someone named Eleanor?" she asked. "Never," I said. "Not once in 50 years. Doris turned the photo over and read the back again. 1964. "That's before you met him. 2 years before. You think she was someone he loved?" "I don't know," I said. "But he kept her picture hidden all this time. That key must open something." We went through every possibility. A safety deposit box, a drawer, a cabinet. Doris tapped the key against her mug and said, "This looks like it belongs in an old wall safe." I went home just after 10 and headed straight for Pearl's study. I hadn't touched much in that room since he passed. The oak desk still held his papers, his pens, even the brass letter opener he used every morning to slice open the day's mail. On the wall above the desk hung a painting, his favorite, of a stormy sea. He used to say it reminded him of Maine. I pulled the painting down gently. Behind it, I found what I hadn't even known I was looking for. A thin seam in the plaster forming a rectangle about the size of a file folder. There was a small keyhole in one corner. The brass key fit perfectly. I turned it. The wall gave way with a quiet click. Inside was a narrow wooden compartment holding a single leather folder tied with a ribbon. On the outside, in Pearl's handwriting, were the words, "To Adelaide, if anything happens." I sat down at his desk, untied the ribbon, and opened the folder. Inside were documents, letters, photographs. At the top was another envelope. I opened it slowly, not knowing what I'd find. What I read changed everything I thought I knew about my husband, about our life, about what came before me and what he never found the courage to say. I sat at Pearl's desk with the envelope resting in my lap, the ribbon still curled at the edges where my fingers had untied it. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air vent overhead. I unfolded the letter and started to read. His handwriting hadn't changed. Still steady. Still deliberate. The same hand that used to write birthday cards in block letters so Bentley could read them when he was small. He began the letter with my name, just Adelaide. And then, "If you are reading this, it means I'm no longer with you." I read slowly. Each line took its time. He said there were things he had never told me. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he wanted to protect me. He said those years before we met had been complicated, that he hadn't been ready for responsibility, not yet. There had been someone named Eleanor, a short relationship. He was 27, she was 21. It hadn't lasted, but she'd gotten pregnant. When she told him, he panicked. His career was just beginning and he didn't want a child. He offered money. She refused. She left town. More than a year later, a letter arrived. Inside was a photo of a baby girl, Fiona. Pearl said he never saw Eleanor again after that. He arranged financial support through a lawyer and kept his distance. Then he met me. Fiona was already 2. He told me that's when his life truly began. He said he was afraid to tell me about Fiona, that he'd made peace with being a father from afar and didn't want to lose what we had. He wrote that Eleanor passed away when Fiona was 18. After that, he met Fiona a few times, quiet meetings during business trips, nothing public. She knew who he was. She never demanded anything from him, never asked to be named. He said she was strong like her mother, that she had a good life, that she had children of her own, now. There was a second page to the letter. He wrote that he'd made a new will 6 months before he died. One that included Fiona. He left her 30% of the company's shares and the contents of a safety deposit box I hadn't known existed. He left Bentley 20% of the shares and the watch collection minus the Vacheron, which was meant to stay with me. He ended the letter with a few short lines. "I should have told you the truth years ago, but I didn't. I'm sorry. I hope someday you'll forgive me." I folded the letter and set it down beside the open folder. Inside were more documents. Fiona's name, an address in Oregon, a phone number written in careful script, a stack of photographs. I looked through them slowly. One showed a girl in braces holding a puppy. Another, a high school graduation cap tilted slightly off-center. One was recent. She stood next to a man and 2 children smiling in front of a row of sunflowers. A boy around 10, a girl, maybe 7. They had her eyes. I sat there for a long time. The photographs stacked neatly again. The letter folded the room beginning to darken as the sun dipped behind the trees. I didn't move until the shadows stretched across the desk. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept seeing Eleanor's name written on the back of the old photo. I kept hearing Pearl's voice the way he sounded when he was nervous, measured quiet. I kept thinking about Bentley, about the way he'd asked about the watch with that forced calm. The way Marilyn's eyes had darted toward the hallway like she already knew where things were. The next morning, I called Doris. She answered on the second ring. Well, she said before I even said hello. I found a letter, I told her, and a will. It was Saturday, and she said she'd put on a pot of coffee. I brought the envelope with me, but I didn't open it right away. I just sat with her in the den while she poured coffee into those mismatched blue mugs we always used. Then I handed her the letter and watched her read. She didn't say much, just nodded a few times, then folded the pages and set them back on the table. You gonna call Fiona? She asked. I don't know. Well, she said you don't have to know today. I looked out the window. Her backyard stretched into woods, just like mine. The branches still bare from winter, but you could see the shape of spring in them. What do you think Bentley knew? I asked. Doris didn't answer right away. If they were that interested in that watch, she said finally, and knew just where to find it, I'd guess they found something. Maybe not the letter, but something. I told her about the documents, about the real will, about the percentages. 30 for Fiona, 20 for Bentley, she said, shaking her head. That's going to go over well. We sat a while longer, not really talking. When I stood up to go, she walked me to the door and rested her hand on my arm. Whatever you decide, she said, you're not alone. I went home and spent the rest of the day sorting through papers. I tucked the will and the photographs back into the folder and placed it in the safest spot I could find. I kept the letter out folded neatly on my nightstand. I didn't call Bentley. I didn't call Fiona. I didn't call the lawyer. Not yet. Instead, I walked through each room in the house, touched the backs of chairs, ran my hand along the stair rail. I looked out over the jasmine bush beneath the bedroom window. It had started to bloom again. I didn't have answers yet, but I knew I wouldn't let this be buried. The folder stayed on my nightstand for 3 more days. Each morning, I'd glance at it in the soft light, and tell myself, today would be the day I'd call the lawyer. Then I'd go downstairs, pour my tea, and let the day pass like any other. On the 4th morning, I moved it to the kitchen table, laid everything out in front of me, the will, the photographs, the letter, and just sat with it. I called Liam first, told him I needed the Vacheron returned. He said Marilyn had been calling almost daily asking about the appraisal. He hadn't given her any information. They're getting impatient, he said. You ready to make a move? I told him I was working on it. That same afternoon, I went to the study and picked up the landline. I called the number Pearl had written beneath Fiona's name. A boy answered. He sounded no older than 12. I asked for Fiona. There was a pause, then footsteps, and a quiet voice came on the line. Hello? She sounded cautious, but kind. I introduced myself. There was silence. Then she said, Adelaide. I told her yes. She asked how I'd found her. I said, I found a letter. That Pearl had left it for me. Another long pause. Then I heard her breath catch. She said I didn't think you knew about me. I told her I hadn't until recently. I said I'd like to talk. Maybe meet. She said she lived just outside Eugene, Oregon. That she ran a small bookshop and worked part-time at the community college. She had 2 children. Her husband Thomas worked for the county. We agreed to meet over the phone again in a few days. I didn't push. She didn't ask for anything. We just talked. For the first time, her voice had a place in the quiet space where all my questions had lived. The next morning, I pulled up the copy of the will again and called my lawyer, Helen Marsh. She'd been Pearl's attorney for years, sharp as a tack and discreet as a shadow. I told her what I'd found. She asked if the will was signed and dated. I said yes, 6 months before his death. Do you have the original? She asked. Yes, I said in his handwriting. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, then, "That's the valid will, then. We'll need to petition to replace the one Bentley filed. Do you want to contest it?" I told her I wasn't ready for court. Not yet. I needed to see what Bentley and Marilyn knew, and how far they'd gone. Helen said, "You'll want to act sooner than later. Once that kind of money starts moving, it's harder to stop." I spent the rest of the day organizing documents. The safety deposit box key was still in the watch. Liam had returned everything without a scratch. I made a list of things to check the box at Citizens Bank: Pearl's old files, the insurance paperwork, and the deed to the house. I wasn't sure what Bentley had seen, but I needed to be sure he hadn't gotten his hands on anything else. That night I baked a peach cobbler and brought half of it to Doris. We sat on her porch swing, and I told her everything. Fiona, the letter, the will, the phone call. She didn't say much, just handed me a spoon and let the cobbler do the talking. 2 days later, Bentley called. Said they were stopping by. They arrived around 4. Marilyn wore a white blouse tucked into trousers too crisp for a casual visit. Bentley looked tired. He asked about my health. Marilyn complimented the rose bush by the porch. Then she said they'd been thinking about long-term plans, that it might be time to discuss assisted living again. I asked if they wanted coffee. Marilyn said she couldn't stay long. Then she asked if I'd thought more about giving Bentley power of attorney. She smiled when she said it. I told them no. She tilted her head and said it would just make things easier. I asked, "For whom?" The smile faded. Bentley shifted in his seat. I reached into the drawer beside me and placed the watch box on the table. Marilyn's eyes fixed on it. I opened it. The Vacheron was back in its slot. I didn't say anything, just closed it again and slid it back into the drawer. Then I said, "Liam told me you tried to sell it." Marilyn's face didn't change, but Bentley looked down at the floor. She said, "We thought you gave it to us." I didn't. More silence. Finally, Bentley stood. "We should go," he said quietly. Marilyn lingered. "You should really think about the future, Adelaide." I looked her in the eye. "I am." They left without another word. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the garden until the sun disappeared behind the hedge. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just listened to the quiet settle back into place. The next day, I walked into Citizens Bank and used the key. Inside the safety deposit box was a sealed envelope with Fiona's name on it. A handwritten note read, "To be given only if she ever comes forward." There was also a folder documents outlining the shares, the adjusted will, a copy of the trust Pearl had created in her name. None of it matched what Bentley had filed with the court. That afternoon, I called Helen again. I was ready. Helen filed the petition quietly, just as she promised. No big announcement, no courtroom drama, just a motion submitted to the probate judge with the correct signatures and dates. The new will, Pearl's real will, was now officially in play. She said it would take a few weeks to process, maybe longer if Bentley tried to contest it. I told her I wasn't worried about that part. Not anymore. What I needed was a conversation. I called Fiona that Friday. She answered right away. I asked if she might consider coming to Georgia, just for a few days. I said there were things I thought she should see in person. She didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll need to talk to Thomas, but yes, I think I'd like that." She flew in the following Tuesday. I picked her up from the airport wearing a navy cardigan and holding a sign with her name on it, like I used to do for Pearl when he came back from conferences. She walked up slowly. Same eyes as Pearl. Same smile, too. She wore a denim jacket and carried a canvas tote. When we hugged, it was soft, but certain, like we both knew it wouldn't be the last. On the drive home, she told me about her children Elise and Jonah. They liked board games and anything involving chocolate. She taught part-time, now mostly American literature. She missed her mother Eleanor more than she expected. She didn't ask about Bentley, and I didn't offer. When we got to the house, she stood for a moment at the threshold before stepping in. I showed her the study, the desk, the picture frames still holding the same photos from years past. She walked slowly, taking it all in. She said the air smelled like lemon polish and something warm, maybe cinnamon. That evening, I made baked chicken and roasted squash. We ate at the kitchen table with Doris joining us because I knew she'd want to. Fiona listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her voice had the weight of someone who'd carried her own share of silence. Doris talked about the weather, the magnolia blossoms blooming early, and the potholes on Sycamore Street. It felt like a Tuesday dinner, not a reunion. The next morning, I showed her the contents of the safety deposit box. She sat at the table reading through the documents Pearl had left. The trust, the adjusted shares, the letter he'd written with her name on the envelope. She didn't open it right away. She held it in her hands for a long time, looking at the writing like it might still change. When she finally unfolded the letter, she read it once, then again. Then she placed it gently on the table. He remembered, she said softly. That afternoon, we walked through the neighborhood. She asked if Bentley knew. I told her not everything, but enough to be nervous. She didn't ask for confrontation. She didn't need to see him. But when I told her about the will, the numbers, the changes the documents Bentley had filed, she nodded slowly. He took what he thought was his, she said, and figured no one would question it. I told her I was done staying quiet. Fiona stayed for 4 days. On the 3rd day, we went through old photos. I pulled out boxes from the attic I hadn't touched in years. We found a picture of Pearl in college. Fiona held it up beside her face and smiled. He had the same crease in his brow when he was thinking, she said. On her last night, we sat in the living room with the windows open. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. She said she'd like to bring the kids down sometime, that she wanted them to know where they came from. I told her the door would always be open. She hugged me before bed, said, "Thank you." I told her no need, but she held on a moment longer than expected. After she left, I stood in the hallway with the quiet back in place. The house didn't feel empty, it felt ready. That Friday, I went to see Helen in person. She had the court date, 2 weeks out. "I've sent notice to Bentley and Marilyn," she said. "They'll know the amended will is valid. They may try to argue undue influence, but the paper trail is solid." I asked if Fiona needed to be there. Helen said no. Her presence wasn't required, but her name would be mentioned, and the court would ask about her. "Will they contest it?" I asked. Helen looked at me carefully. "They might, but if they're smart, they won't." I went home and ironed a blouse. Pale blue. The one I wore to Pearl's retirement dinner. The next morning, Bentley called. Said he and Marilyn wanted to come by. I told them I'd be home at 3. When they arrived, Marilyn didn't waste time. She asked if I was serious about contesting the estate, if I'd really gone and hired a lawyer. I told her yes. Bentley stayed quiet. I opened the drawer beside me and placed a copy of the will on the table. She scanned it quickly. "Fiona," she said aloud. "That's who gets 30%. I nodded. Marilyn scoffed. "You're rewarding a secret." I didn't answer. Bentley asked if I'd talked to Fiona. I said yes. He asked what she wanted. She didn't ask for anything, I said. She was given it. They both sat in silence for a long time. Then Bentley looked up. "Does this change everything?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "It does." They left quietly. That evening, Doris called to check in. I told her what happened. She said, "They're rattled." I told her I wasn't. I made tea, sat on the porch. The wind had picked up a little, and the sky was turning that soft golden color it always does before the sun dips below the tree line. It felt like a new season was starting. The court date arrived without fanfare. I woke up early, ironed my blouse again, and set out a pair of low heels I hadn't worn in years. Helen picked me up at 9. We didn't speak much during the drive, just a few remarks about the weather and how quiet traffic had been. But when we pulled up in front of the courthouse, she reached over and squeezed my hand once before stepping out. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and paper. The room wasn't crowded, just a few benches, a clerk organizing folders, and a judge seated behind the long oak bench. Bentley and Marilyn were already there. He wore a gray suit that looked a size too big around the shoulders. She was in black with a silk scarf and too much perfume. Helen spoke first. She presented the signed, dated copy of Pearl's amended will, along with the documents from the safety deposit box, and a signed affidavit from Liam confirming the watch's provenance and the documents found with it. The judge looked through the pages, took his time. He asked a few questions when the original will had been filed, who had access to the safety deposit box, whether there was any evidence Pearl had been under pressure when he made the changes. Helen answered plainly, precisely. She explained how the revised will had been written in Pearl's own hand, how it had been stored with other important estate materials, and how it clearly reflected his intent, especially regarding Fiona. Then Bentley's lawyer stood up. He was younger than I expected, and he looked nervous. He tried to suggest that Fiona's existence changed the family dynamic, that perhaps Pearl had been manipulated. But he had no evidence, only speculation. And when the judge asked if there was any proof of undue influence, he stammered and deferred. Marilyn leaned in once to whisper something to the attorney, but whatever it was, didn't change the outcome. The judge ruled in favor of the amended will. He declared it legally valid, and the probate court would now proceed under its terms. Fiona was officially named in the estate. The shares would be distributed accordingly. The watch collection, its full value listed in the revised trust, would remain untouched until settlement. Bentley didn't look at me as we left. Marilyn did. Just once. Her eyes lingered for a moment before she turned sharply and walked down the hallway. Helen and I stood on the courthouse steps. She said she'd send me the official order once it was processed. I thanked her. She offered to drive me home, but I said I'd walk. The weather was clear, the sky pale blue with a breeze just strong enough to keep the flag across the street moving. On the way back, I stopped at the corner bakery. Bought 2 scones, one for me, one for Doris. When I got home, she was already on the porch with her knitting. I handed her the bag. "Victory food?" she asked. "Something like that," I said. We sat in the afternoon sun, neither of us saying much. That evening, Fiona called. I told her the court had accepted the will. She was quiet for a moment, then said she'd been thinking about bringing the kids down for Thanksgiving. I told her they'd be more than welcome. She asked how Bentley and Marilyn had taken it. I told her they hadn't said much. Just left. 2 days later, a letter arrived. It was from Bentley, handwritten. He apologized for not speaking up earlier. Said he'd known about Fiona for years, since shortly after Pearl's funeral. That he'd found a photograph in one of Pearl's briefcases, and instead of asking questions, had buried it. He wrote that Marilyn had pushed him to move quickly after the funeral. That they'd both told themselves they were protecting me. That he now realized they were protecting themselves. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deny what they'd done. He ended the letter by saying he'd step back from the estate entirely. That he would not appeal the court's decision, and that he hoped someday Fiona might read the letter too. I folded it and put it in the drawer beside the watch box. The next morning, I drove to the florist and ordered an arrangement to be sent to Fiona's shop. Yellow roses, white tulips, and a single sprig of rosemary tucked in the middle. The card read, "From your father's house, with love." I spent that afternoon in the study, dusting the shelves, reordering the books. I opened the top drawer of the desk and saw the envelope I'd left there the day Fiona visited. her letter from Pearl still inside. I didn't open it, just rested my hand on it for a moment before closing the drawer again. That night, I slept without waking once. The Saturday before Thanksgiving, I stood in the dining room smoothing out the same cream tablecloth I'd used every year since 1985. I had polished the silver the night before and arranged pine cones and cinnamon sticks down the center like I always used to. Doris had dropped off a fresh pie that morning, and I'd already made the cranberry relish. The house smelled like sage and roasted sweet potatoes. I'd told Fiona to bring the children around 3, and I planned to serve dinner at 5, just like we always did when Pearl was alive. At 2:30, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Fiona standing on the porch with 2 children at her sides. The boy, around 10, was holding a foil-wrapped dish carefully in both hands. The girl, maybe 12, had curls just like Fiona's and wore a navy cardigan buttoned all the way up. Fiona smiled a little uncertain, but her eyes were bright. "This is Ella," she said, touching the girl's shoulder, "and this is Miles." I stepped back to let them in. The moment Ella saw the formal china laid out on the dining room table, she whispered, "Whoa!" and that broke the ice. We spent the next half hour warming up their green bean casserole and setting out extra place settings. They'd barely finished their first bites when the front door opened again. I heard it before I saw him. Bentley's voice, low and tight. Marilyn followed behind, already talking. I met them in the foyer. Bentley carried a grocery bag with 2 bottles of wine. Marilyn had her purse tucked under one arm and was brushing invisible lint from her coat. "I didn't know you'd be coming," I said. Bentley looked down at the floor. "We thought we should be here." Before I could answer, Ella's voice floated in from the dining room. "Mom, do you want me to slice the pie now?" Marilyn's head turned sharply. "Mom." I stepped aside. Fiona was walking in from the kitchen, carrying a tray of mugs. The children were behind her. Marilyn's mouth opened, then closed again. Bentley set the wine bag on the console table. He looked at Fiona for a long time. "I got your letter," Fiona said quietly. He nodded. "I meant what I wrote." Fiona nodded too, but didn't say anything else. She walked past them and back into the dining room. The children followed. I didn't say anything either, just turned and walked back to my seat. For a moment, Bentley and Marilyn stayed in the foyer. Then I heard the soft creak of the door closing behind them. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of wind brushing through the front shrubs. The rest of the evening moved in soft, steady pieces. Fiona's children asked about Pearl's fishing trips, about the big framed photo over the mantel, about the snow globe collection in the hallway case. I brought out old photo albums. Fiona lingered longest on the one from '89, the one with her mother's handwriting in the margins. Later, after the kids had gone to the guest room and Fiona and I were finishing the last of the decaf in the kitchen, she asked, "Why didn't he ever tell me sooner? I didn't have an answer." I only knew he had tried in the end. And sometimes that's all people are able to give. She stayed the night. The next morning, I made waffles and bacon, and we sat by the window watching the gray sky turn pink. That afternoon, she helped me pack up the dishes. As we worked, she asked if I'd ever thought about coming to Boston for a while. Maybe around Easter. "I think the kids would like that," she said. I told her I'd think about it. She smiled, and I could tell she already knew I would. After they left, I stood at the doorway for a long while. The house was quiet again, but not heavy, just still. The photo albums were still out on the coffee table, and the guest sheets were folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I didn't rush to put anything away. The next morning, the mail arrived with a single manila envelope from the probate court. Inside was the formal statement closing the estate. The final page had my name, Fiona's name, and Bentley's 3 signatures in black ink. I folded it once and placed it in the drawer beside Pearl's letter. It snowed the following week, just a light dusting the kind that turns the roof silver and softens the edges of the lawn. I stood by the kitchen window with my coffee watching it gather on the garden stones. The house felt different, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because it no longer held the weight of something unspoken. Fiona had left behind a scarf by mistake, dark green, with a tear near the hem, and I hadn't moved it from the coat rack. Every time I passed it, I felt something settle in me. Not grief, not guilt, just a kind of quiet knowing. I called her a few days later to tell her about the scarf. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. She told me Ella had written a school essay about a Thanksgiving that surprised her, and Miles had started asking when they could visit again. I said Easter sounded good. I meant it. Bentley didn't reach out again after the dinner. Not that week. Not the one after. I didn't expect him to. But in early January, a small box arrived in the mail, no note, no return address, just my name in his handwriting. Inside was the watch. The one Fiona had held in her palm that day. The one I'd worn on a chain for years. It had a new leather band. The crystal had been cleaned. It was ticking again. I placed it on the mantel beside a photo of Pearl holding Fiona as a baby. Not in the middle, not where it would draw attention, just tucked into the frame's corner, like a quiet presence that didn't need to explain itself. The probate court closed the estate before spring. Everything was finalized, clean, straightforward. Fiona didn't ask for anything beyond the letter and the few things I'd already offered. A photo, a blanket, a stack of postcards her mother had saved. Marilyn never spoke to me again. Bentley sent one final text the day the papers were signed. It just said, "Thank you for telling her." I never replied. When Easter came, I packed a small bag and flew to Boston. Fiona met me at the airport with both kids in the back seat. Ella had made a sign with my name on it in bubble letters. Miles handed me a bag of jelly beans and said, "Mom said you liked the red ones best." They had set up the guest room with clean sheets and a little vase of daisies on the windowsill. That night, after the kids went to bed, Fiona and I sat on the back porch with cups of peppermint tea. She asked me about my garden. I asked her if she'd ever visited the park where her mother used to take her. She said, "Not yet." Maybe we could go together. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about telling the truth, even if it's late, even if it's quiet, even if only one person is listening. That letter wasn't just a last confession. It was a doorway, one that Pearl opened and one I chose to walk through. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of something buried or something brave, I hope you'll leave a note in the comments or just sit with it a little while longer. Either way, I'm glad you were here.